Some fathers leave behind memories and photographs. Graham Ellroy's father left him 30 years of silence and a mystery he never asked to solve. For 3 decades, Graham worked as a mechanic in Seattle, raising his autistic son alone on a tight budget, while his father lived 40 miles away in a world Graham was never invited into. Then came the phone call about an inheritance worth millions. When Graham returned to claim what was his own family tried to block him at every turn. They said the will was fake. They said he had no right. But the harder they fought to keep him away, the more Graham realized his father had left him something far more valuable than money. What secret was buried in that inheritance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The voicemail came on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a reminder about Danny's dentist appointment and a spam call about extended car warranties. Graham had been elbow deep in the transmission of a 2008 Honda Accord when his phone buzzed in his back pocket. He'd let it go to voicemail, like he always did during work hours. The cars didn't fix themselves, and his boss at Martinez Auto Repair had been good to him for the past 12 years. Good enough that Graham never wanted to give him a reason to regret hiring a guy who sometimes had to leave early for school meetings or therapy appointments. It wasn't until his lunch break, sitting in his truck with a homemade sandwich and a thermos of coffee, that Graham listened to his messages. The woman's voice was professional, measured, the kind of tone that suggested she delivered difficult news for a living. "Mr. Ellroy, this is Patricia Jennings from the law offices of Pemberton and Associates in Ridgemont, Washington. I'm calling regarding the estate of your father, Richard James Ellroy, who passed away on March 18th. We need to discuss some urgent matters concerning his will. Please return my call at your earliest convenience." Graham sat very still. The sandwich felt heavy in his hands. His father was dead. He hadn't spoken to Richard Ellroy in 30 years, hadn't seen him in just as long. There had been no birthday cards, no Christmas calls, no attempts at reconciliation from either side. The silence between them had calcified into something solid and permanent, a wall neither man had tried to breach. And now the old man was gone, and Graham felt nothing. Or at least, that's what he told himself, as he set down his sandwich, no longer hungry. The drive home that evening took him through the familiar streets of his Seattle neighborhood, past the check-cashing place and the laundromat where he and Danny did their wash every Sunday. Their apartment building was a 3-story walk-up, with peeling paint and a landlord who took 2 weeks to fix anything. But it was theirs, and it was clean, and most importantly, it was quiet enough for Danny. Danny was sitting at the kitchen table when Graham walked in, his 14-year-old son's attention focused entirely on a notebook where he was drawing precise geometric patterns. Danny didn't look up immediately. He never did. Transitions were hard, and Graham had learned years ago to give his son the space he needed to shift his focus. "Hey, buddy," Graham said softly, setting his keys on the counter. "How was school?" Danny's pencil continued moving for another 3 careful strokes before he looked up. His eyes, the same grey-green as Graham's own, met his father's for just a moment before drifting to the side. "Mrs. Patterson said I did excellent work on my math test, 97%. That's my guy." Graham felt the familiar swell of pride in his chest. "What happened to the other 3%? I forgot to show my work on problem 14. But I got the right answer." Danny's voice carried a hint of indignation that made Graham smile. "Next time you'll remember. You hungry? I'm thinking grilled cheese and tomato soup. With the good bread?" With the good bread. They fell into their evening routine, the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the years. Graham cooked while Danny finished his homework, the kitchen filled with the sound of butter sizzling and Danny's occasional questions about history, dates, or vocabulary words. These were the moments Graham treasured most, the ordinary evenings that added up to a life. Not an easy life, certainly not a wealthy one, but an honest one, a good one. It wasn't until after dinner, after Danny had retreated to his room for his allotted hour of computer time before bed, that Graham allowed himself to think about the phone call. He sat on their sagging couch, the one he'd bought second-hand when Danny was 3, and pulled out the brass compass he always carried in his pocket. The compass was old, its brass case worn smooth by years of handling. His father had given it to him on his 12th birthday, back when things between them had still been good, back before everything fell apart. "A man needs to know which way he's headed," his father had said, pressing the compass into Graham's palm. "When you're lost, this'll always point you home." Graham had treasured it then, carried it everywhere, consulted it on camping trips and hikes in the mountains around Ridgemont. The town had been different back then, or maybe Graham had just been too young to see it clearly. All he'd known was that his father was important, that people respected Richard Ellroy, that they lived in a big house with a yard, and his mother made pot roast on Sundays. Then his mother died. A brain aneurysm, sudden and cruel, taking her in the middle of a conversation about what to plant in the garden that spring. Graham had been 23, home from community college for the weekend. One moment his mother was laughing about something he'd said, the next she was gone, collapsed on the kitchen floor before the ambulance could even be called. The funeral had been large, full of people Graham didn't know, business associates and town officials, who spoke about what a gracious woman Helen Ellroy had been. Graham had stood beside his father at the reception, both of them silent, both of them drowning. He'd wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his father's shoulder, to share the grief that was crushing them both. But his father had seemed encased in ice, untouchable and distant. When Graham had finally tried to talk to him the next day, tried to ask if he was okay, his father had looked at him with eyes that held nothing. "You should go back to school," Richard had said. "There's nothing for you here." Graham had tried to argue, tried to say he wanted to stay, to help, to be there. But his father had turned away, walked into his study, and closed the door. That was the pattern that emerged in the weeks that followed. Graham would call, and his father wouldn't answer. Graham would drive down to Ridgemont, and the housekeeper would say, "Mr. Ellroy wasn't seeing anyone." Letters went unanswered. Eventually, Graham stopped trying. He told himself it was grief, that his father just needed time. But time passed, and the silence remained. Graham finished his associate degree, got a job at an auto shop, met a woman named Sarah who seemed to understand him. They'd married quickly, maybe too quickly, and Danny had come along a year later. The autism diagnosis at age 3 had been devastating, not because Graham loved his son any less, but because it meant Danny would face challenges Graham couldn't fix with a wrench and determination. Sarah had left when Danny was 4, unable to handle the meltdowns and the therapy appointments and the future that looked so different from what she'd imagined. Graham had filed for divorce, taken full custody, and rebuilt his life around his son. He'd learned about sensory issues and communication strategies. He'd become an expert in IEPs and occupational therapy. He'd discovered reserves of patience he'd never known he possessed. And through it all, his father had remained absent, a ghost in Graham's past who never reached out, never asked about his grandson, never acknowledged that Graham existed. Now the ghost was dead, and Graham was holding a compass that pointed nowhere useful. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Patricia Jennings had left. It rang 3 times before she answered. "Miss Jennings, this is Graham Ellroy returning your call." "Mr. Ellroy, thank you for calling back." There was a rustling of papers on her end. "First, let me express my condolences on your father's passing. I know this must be difficult." Graham said nothing. What was there to say? "I'm calling because you're named in your father's will," she continued. "In fact, you're the primary beneficiary. We need you to come to Ridgemont to handle the estate matters. Would you be available this Friday for a reading of the will?" Graham's mind struggled to process the words. Primary beneficiary. His father had left him something. After 30 years of silence, the old man had remembered he had a son. "Mr. Ellroy, are you still there?" "I'm here." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "What exactly are we talking about? The estate, I mean." Patricia Jennings hesitated, and Graham could hear the careful consideration in that pause. "I think it's best if we discuss the details in person, but I can tell you that it's substantial, very substantial. Your father was quite successful in his later years." Successful. The word felt like a stone in Graham's gut. His father had been successful while Graham had been choosing between paying the electric bill and buying Danny new shoes. Successful while Graham had been eating ramen so his son could have fresh vegetables. The bitterness rose in his throat, sharp and unexpected. "Friday," Graham said. "What time?" 10 o'clock. The office address is on the voicemail. "And Mr. Ellroy, you should know that other family members will be present. Your father's brother had children, and they're contesting certain aspects of the will." Of course they were. Graham had cousins he barely remembered, relatives who'd been part of the Ridgemont world that had closed its doors to him. Why would they want to share anything with the outcast son? "I'll be there," Graham said, and ended the call. He sat in the dim living room, the only light coming from the kitchen and the glow of Danny's computer from down the hall. His whole life had been built around stability, around creating a safe and predictable world for his son. Going back to Ridgemont meant disrupting that stability. It meant facing a past he'd buried and people who'd never wanted him around in the first place. But it also meant something for Danny's future. Whatever his father had left, substantial meant money. Money meant college funds and better therapy, and maybe not having to worry about every unexpected expense. For Danny, Graham would face anything. He looked down at the compass in his hand, its needle pointing steadily north. "When you're lost," his father had said, "this'll always point you home." Graham wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was and where he was going, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to find out why his father had pushed him away. Maybe it was time to go back to Ridgemont and get some answers. He walked down the hall to Danny's room, knocked twice the signal they'd established years ago, and waited for permission to enter. "Come in, Dad." Danny was still at his computer, working on something that looked like a digital map. He glanced at Graham, then back at his screen. "Hey, buddy, I need to talk to you about something." Danny's hands stilled on the keyboard. Change was difficult, and Graham's serious tone had registered. "I have to go on a trip this Friday, just for the day, maybe overnight, Mrs. Chen next door said she'd stay with you." "Where are you going?" Danny's voice had that careful flatness that meant he was processing something stressful. "To a town called Ridgemont. It's where I grew up. My father, your grandfather, he died, and I need to take care of some things." Danny turned in his chair, actually looking at Graham's face, which meant this was important to him. "Did you love your father?" The question hit Graham harder than he'd expected. He sat down on the edge of Danny's bed, taking a moment to find the right words. "I did. Once. But we had a falling out a long time ago, before you were born. Sometimes adults make mistakes, and we didn't fix ours. I'm sorry you never got to meet him." "Are you sad he's dead?" Graham considered this. "I'm sad about what could have been. Does that make sense?" Danny nodded slowly. "Like when I can't do something because of my autism, and you're sad about the difference between what is and what could be." "Exactly like that." Graham felt his throat tighten. His son understood more than people gave him credit for. "Will there be money?" Danny asked, his practicality surfacing. "Maybe. I don't know yet. If there is, can we get the science kit I showed you? The one with the real microscope?" Graham smiled. "If there is, you can have any science kit you want." Danny seemed satisfied with this. He turned back to his computer, the conversation apparently complete in his mind. Graham stood, ruffled his son's hair in the way Danny usually tolerated, and left him to his work. Back in the living room, Graham pulled out the plastic grocery bag he kept in the hall closet, the one he used for overnight trips. He didn't have much to pack: a change of clothes, his phone charger, toiletries. He added the compass, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe for courage. Maybe just because it had always been with him. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Graham stared at the ceiling and thought about his father. Tried to imagine the old man in his final days, sick or lonely or afraid. Had he thought about Graham? Had he regretted the silence? Or had naming Graham in the will been some final obligation, a duty discharged so he could die with a clean conscience? Graham didn't know. But Friday, he'd drive back to Ridgemont, back to the town he'd sworn never to set foot in again. He'd face whatever waited for him there: hostile relatives, uncomfortable memories, questions that might never have good answers. For Danny, he'd do it. For his son's future, he'd walk back into the past. The compass sat on his nightstand, its brass case catching the streetlight from outside. North, it pointed. Always north. Tomorrow, he'd point himself south, back to where everything had gone wrong. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally understand why. The drive to Ridgemont took 90 minutes through morning traffic, past the sprawl of Seattle's southern suburbs and into the quieter landscape of strip malls and retirement communities that marked Washington's smaller towns. Graham had left at 7, leaving Danny with Mrs. Chen and a list of emergency numbers he knew by heart, but wrote down anyway. The roads were familiar in the way old scars are familiar. You know they're there, you remember how you got them, but you'd rather not look too closely. Ridgemont hadn't changed much. The downtown still had the same brick storefronts, the same wide streets lined with maples that would blaze orange in the fall. The coffee shop where he'd worked one summer was now a boutique selling artisanal soaps. The movie theater had been converted into a community center, but the bones of the town remained, solid and prosperous. The kind of place where people raised families and built equity and never questioned whether they belonged. Graham had never belonged here, even when he'd lived here. He understood that now. The Ellroy estate sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, where Ridgemont gave way to newer developments. Graham drove past it first, not ready to stop, not ready to face it. The house was bigger than he remembered, a sprawling Victorian painted cream with dark green trim. The lawn was immaculate, the hedges precisely shaped, the driveway a smooth expanse of fresh asphalt. Money whispered from every corner of the property. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was what his father had built in 30 years of silence. The law office of Pemberton and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a building on Main Street, above a real estate agency with photos of expensive homes in the window. Graham parked his 15-year-old pickup truck between a Lexus and a Mercedes, feeling every year of rust and faded paint. He grabbed his grocery bag from the passenger seat. He'd brought a notebook and pen, thinking he should take notes, and headed inside. The waiting room was designed to project calm authority. Leather chairs, dark wood paneling, framed diplomas on the walls. A receptionist who looked fresh out of college smiled at him professionally. "Graham Ellroy," he said. "I have an appointment." "Of course, Mr. Ellroy. The others are already in the conference room. Mr. Pemberton will be with you shortly. Can I get you coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you." She led him down a hallway to a conference room with a long mahogany table. 4 people were already seated, and they all turned to look at him when he entered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The woman at the head of the table was about his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Graham's monthly rent. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was both severe and elegant, and her eyes assessed him with the cold precision of an accountant reviewing questionable expenses. This had to be Miranda. "Graham." Her voice matched her appearance, polished, controlled, sharp. "It's been a long time." Miranda. He didn't remember her well, just flashes of family gatherings from his childhood. She'd been the bossy cousin who'd organized the other kids into elaborate games with complicated rules. 30 years. You look like you've had a hard life. It wasn't quite sympathy in her tone. It was something closer to satisfaction. The man beside her stood and extended his hand. He was tall, handsome, in a practiced way, with silver threading through his dark hair. "Robert Sutter, Miranda's husband. We haven't met." Graham shook his hand. The grip was firm, performative. The older woman across the table offered a sad smile. "Graham, dear, I'm your Aunt Diane, Richard's sister-in-law. This is my son, Paul." Paul was younger than Graham, maybe 40, with thinning hair and nervous hands that fidgeted with a pen. He nodded, but didn't speak. "I'm sorry about your father," Aunt Diane continued. "I know you two had your difficulties, but his passing is still a loss." Before Graham could respond, the door opened, and a man in his 60s entered, carrying a leather portfolio. He was trim and professional, with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime mediating other people's conflicts. "Good morning. I'm Harold Pemberton, Mr. Ellroy. Thank you for coming." He shook Graham's hand, then took his seat at the table. "Shall we begin?" Pemberton opened the portfolio and withdrew a document, setting it in front of him with careful precision. "This is the last will and testament of Richard James Ellroy, executed on September 14th of last year, 6 months before his death. It was witnessed by myself and my associate, and I can attest to your father's complete mental competency at the time of signing." He glanced around the table, his gaze lingering a moment on Miranda. "The will is straightforward. Richard Ellroy leaves his entire estate to his son, Graham Michael Ellroy. This includes the family home and property, all financial assets, investment accounts, and full ownership of Ellroy Development Company. The estimated total value is approximately $4.3 million. The room was silent. Graham felt the number like a physical blow. $4 million. His father had been worth $4 million while Graham had been clipping coupons and buying Danny's clothes at thrift stores. "That's impossible." Miranda's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "That will is fraudulent." Pemberton's expression didn't change. "I assure you, Miss Ellroy Sutter, the will is entirely legitimate. My uncle would never have left everything to him." Miranda's face had flushed, her composure cracking. "Graham abandoned the family 30 years ago. He never visited, never called. Why would Richard leave him anything, let alone everything?" "That's between your uncle and his son," Pemberton said quietly. Robert leaned forward, his voice reasonable, diplomatic. "Mr. Pemberton, surely you can understand our concern. Graham hasn't been part of this family for 3 decades. He had no relationship with Richard. It's only natural to question whether there was undue influence." "Undue influence?" Graham found his voice. "I haven't spoken to my father in 30 years. How exactly would I have influenced him?" "Through intermediaries," Miranda said. "Through lawyers, perhaps. Through people who got to him in his final months when he was weak and sick." "Your uncle was not sick," Pemberton interjected. "He died of a sudden cardiac event. Up until his death, he was in excellent health and sharp mental condition." Miranda pulled a document from her own briefcase and slid it across the table. "This is also a will, Mr. Pemberton, dated 2 years before the one you're presenting. In this version, Richard leaves his estate divided equally among his extended family. This is the real will." Pemberton examined the document briefly. "I'm aware of this previous will. Your uncle specifically revoked it when he executed the new one. Or someone convinced him to." Miranda's eyes fixed on Graham, someone who stood to gain millions. Graham felt anger building in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. He'd come here expecting nothing, wanting only answers about why his father had pushed him away. Instead, he was being accused of manipulation and fraud by people who'd never cared whether he lived or died. "I didn't even know my father was alive until 3 days ago," he said, his voice low. "I certainly didn't know he had money. I came here because the law office called and said I needed to." "How convenient." Miranda's smile was cold. "The prodigal son returns just in time to claim his fortune." "That's enough." Pemberton's voice carried unexpected steel. "Miss Ellroy Sutter, if you wish to contest the will, that's your right." But groundless accusations help no one. We're not making groundless accusations. Robert pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, then turned it toward Pemberton. We have evidence that Graham made contact with Richard through a private investigator 8 months ago. We have phone records showing calls between Richard and a Seattle number registered to Graham Ellroy in the weeks before the new will was executed. Graham stared at the phone, confused. I don't know what you're talking about. I never called him. I never hired anyone to contact him. The records don't lie, Miranda said. Pemberton studied the phone screen, his expression thoughtful. I'll need to review this evidence properly. In the meantime, I suggest we take a 30-day period for investigation. Graham, you're entitled to access the estate and review your father's papers. Miranda, you're welcome to pursue your concerns through proper legal channels. 30 days. Miranda stood abruptly. In 30 days, he could strip the estate bare. The assets will be frozen during the investigation, Pemberton said. Nothing can be removed or sold. Paul spoke for the first time, his voice quiet. Mom, maybe we should just accept it. If Uncle Richard wanted Graham to have everything, that was his choice. Be quiet. Paul. Miranda didn't even look at him. She gathered her materials, Robert following her lead. Mr. Pemberton, you'll be hearing from our attorneys. Graham, enjoy your 30 days. They're all you're going to get. She walked out, Robert and Aunt Diane following. Paul lingered a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but ultimately he just shook his head and left. The door closed, leaving Graham alone with Pemberton. Well, the lawyer said dryly, that went about as expected. Graham slumped in his chair. I don't understand any of this. Why would my father leave me anything? We hadn't spoken in 30 years. I don't know. Pemberton pulled off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket. Your father never explained his reasoning to me. He simply said he wanted the will changed, and he was very specific about his wishes. And those phone records? I never called him. I don't even have his number. We'll look into it. In the meantime, you should go to the house. I have the keys. He pulled a ring of keys from his portfolio and slid them across the table. The security code is written on this card. Your father lived alone. He let the housekeeper go about 8 months ago. Graham picked up the keys, their weight solid and real in his palm. What was he like? In the end, I mean. Pemberton considered the question carefully. Quiet, thoughtful. He seemed to be carrying something heavy, if that makes sense. Like a man with regrets. He paused. He asked about you once. Wanted to know if I thought you'd come to the will reading. What did you tell him? I said I thought you would. He seemed relieved. Graham stood, pocketing the keys. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. Graham. The lawyer's voice stopped him at the door. Whatever your father's reasons, he wanted you to have this. Don't let Miranda take it from you without a fight. Outside, the morning had turned grey, clouds rolling in from the west. Graham sat in his truck for a long time, keys in hand, trying to process everything that had just happened. $4 million. A house, a company, and a family that hated him for it. He pulled out his phone and called Danny's number. Mrs. Chen answered. Everything okay, Dad? Danny's voice was anxious. Everything's fine, buddy. Just checking in. You doing okay? Mrs. Chen made pancakes. They weren't as good as yours. Graham smiled despite everything. I'll make you better ones when I get home. Love you. Love you too. He ended the call and started the truck. The Ellroy estate was waiting. His father's house. His house now, if the will held up. Graham pulled into traffic, pointing his truck toward the edge of town, toward answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The gate at the entrance to the Ellroy estate stood open. Graham pulled through slowly, taking in the manicured grounds, the established trees, the careful landscaping that spoke of regular professional maintenance. His truck felt obscene on this pristine driveway, a rust bucket intruder in a world of polished surfaces. The house was even more impressive up close. 3 stories of Victorian architecture with a wraparound porch and bay windows that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Graham parked and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering his nerve. He'd lived here once, from birth until his mother died. But that house had been different, smaller in his memory, warmer. This building looked like a museum, beautiful and untouchable. The keys Pemberton had given him included one for the front door. It turned smoothly in the lock, and Graham stepped inside. The entry hall was 2 stories high, with a chandelier and a curved staircase leading to the upper floors. Hardwood gleamed under his work boots. To his left, a formal living room with furniture that looked unused. To his right, what had once been his father's study, the door closed. Graham walked through the house slowly, each room revealing more wealth than the last. A chef's kitchen with commercial appliances. A dining room with a table that could seat 12. A library with built-in shelves floor to ceiling. Everything was clean but felt abandoned, like a house waiting for owners who would never return. Upstairs, he found his father's bedroom. The bed was made with military precision. On the nightstand sat a water glass and a book, a biography of Teddy Roosevelt, bookmark halfway through. His father would never finish it now. Graham opened the closet and found rows of suits, expensive shoes, the wardrobe of a successful man. Nothing like the flannel shirts and work pants Graham wore. They were different men, he and his father. They'd always been different. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the dresser, a photograph in a simple frame. Graham picked it up, his hands suddenly unsteady. It was him. 8 years old, maybe 9, holding up a fish he'd caught on a camping trip. His mother had taken the picture. He could hear her voice across the years, telling them to smile, to hold still. His father had kept this photograph. Through 30 years of silence, through whatever had driven them apart, Richard Ellroy had kept this picture where he'd see it every morning and every night. Graham set it down carefully and left the room before the tightness in his chest could become something more. Back downstairs, he finally opened the door to the study. This room felt lived in, unlike the others. Papers on the desk, books piled on the side table, reading glasses abandoned mid-task. A coffee mug, long, empty, still sitting beside the computer. Graham sat in his father's chair and looked around. This was where the old man had spent his time, where he'd worked and thought and maybe remembered. The walls were lined with filing cabinets. The desk drawers were locked. A sound from outside made him turn. Through the window, he could see an elderly Asian woman standing at the property line, watching the house. When she noticed Graham looking, she didn't turn away. Instead, she raised her hand in a small wave. Graham left the study and walked outside. The woman was in her 70s, dressed in a cardigan and gardening gloves, pruning shears in one hand. Her yard bordered the Ellroy property, separated by a low hedge. "You must be the son," she said as Graham approached. Her accent was slight, her English precise. "You look like your mother." "I'm Graham, Lily Chen. I've lived next door for 42 years. I watched you grow up." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you. You probably don't remember me. You were young when you left." Graham did remember, vaguely, the nice neighbor lady who'd given him cookies sometimes, who'd kept an eye on him when his parents were busy. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? What was my father like? In recent years, I mean." She set down her pruning shears and considered the question. "Lonely. He became very private after you left. He used to have parties, gatherings, but that all stopped. In the last year especially, he barely left the house." "Did he have visitors?" "His family came sometimes. The niece, Miranda. She visited often, especially in the last months. They would argue. I could hear them through the windows in the summer." Graham's attention sharpened. "Argue about what?" "I don't know. But I could tell from the tone. She was angry about something." Mrs. Chen paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. Your father was afraid, I think. Afraid of what? I don't know. But I would see him at night, working in his study. The lights would be on until 3, 4 in the morning. Once I woke up at 2 and saw him in the yard, just standing there, looking at the house like he was memorizing it. A chill ran down Graham's spine. When was this? Maybe 3 months before he died, around the time he fired Maria. Maria? His housekeeper. She worked for him for 15 years. Then suddenly he let her go. She was very upset. Do you know where I could find her? Mrs. Chen pulled a small notepad from her pocket and wrote down an address. She cleans houses in town now. Tell her I sent you. She might talk to you. Graham took the paper. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I appreciate this. Your father was a good man, Graham. Whatever happened between you, whatever people say, he was a good man. In the end, I think he was trying to make things right. Graham wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe his father had thought about him, had cared, had wanted to repair what was broken between them. But 30 years of silence was hard to overcome with hope alone. He drove to the address Mrs. Chen had given him, a modest neighborhood on the other side of town. Maria Gonzalez answered the door in cleaning clothes, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and calloused hands. When Graham explained who he was, her expression closed like a door. I have nothing to say about Mr. Ellroy. Please, I'm just trying to understand what happened. Why he left me everything, why my family is fighting me. Mrs. Chen said he fired you suddenly. Can you tell me why? Maria looked past him to the street, checking if anyone was watching. You should go. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know the truth. Something in his voice must have convinced her. She stepped back, letting him inside, but didn't invite him to sit. Your father changed in his last year, she said quietly. He found something. Papers, I think, from the company. After that, he was different. Scared. He started locking everything, changing codes. Then he told me I couldn't work there anymore. Did he say why? He said it wasn't safe, that I should stay away from the family, from the house. He gave me 6 months severance, cash, made me promise not to talk about what I'd seen. What had you seen? Maria's hands twisted together. I saw Miranda going through his files when he was out. I saw her taking pictures of documents with her phone. When I told your father, that's when everything changed. He was terrified. Of Miranda? Of what she might do, he said. She stopped, reconsidering. Please, Graham said. He was my father. I have a right to know. He said the family business wasn't clean, that there were things he'd been part of, things he regretted. He said he was trying to make it right, but they wouldn't let him. Maria looked at Graham with something like pity. He talked about you sometimes. Said he'd made a terrible mistake pushing you away. Said he did it to protect you. The words hit Graham like a fist to the chest. Protect me from what? I don't know. He never said, but whatever it was, he thought it was worth losing you over. Graham left Maria's house with more questions than answers. His father had been afraid. Miranda had been searching for something. The family business had secrets dark enough that his father had sacrificed his relationship with his only son to keep Graham away from them. He drove back to the estate as afternoon faded into evening. Inside, he went straight to the study and started searching. The filing cabinets were locked, but the keys were on the ring Pemberton had given him. Inside, he found decades of business records, contracts, permits, financial statements. It would take weeks to go through everything, but Graham had 30 days, and nothing waiting for him back in Seattle except a motel room and a son who believed his father was strong enough to handle anything. He pulled out the first file and started reading. Graham spent 2 days at the estate, sleeping on the couch in the study because he couldn't bring himself to use his father's bed. He called Danny every evening, listening to his son's detailed recounting of his day, what he ate, what he learned, what patterns he noticed in the weather. The familiar routine grounded Graham when nothing else about this situation did. The files painted a picture of a successful development company, building subdivisions and commercial properties throughout the region. But as Graham dug deeper, he started noticing irregularities. Payments to consulting firms that didn't seem to exist. Contracts with city officials for projects that appeared overpriced. Money moving in patterns that didn't quite make sense. On the third day, Graham decided he needed help understanding what he was looking at. He drove to Ridgemont Community Bank, a solid brick building that had been there since before he was born. The bank manager, Tom Fitzgerald, was close to retirement age, with white hair and the comfortable manner of someone who'd spent his life in a small town. "Graham Ellroy," Tom said, shaking his hand warmly. "I heard you were back. I'm sorry about your father. He was a good customer, always paid his bills on time." "Thank you. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about his accounts." Tom's expression became more guarded. "You understand I can't share specific account information without proper authorization." "I have authorization. I'm the executor of his estate." Graham showed him the letter from Pemberton. Tom examined it carefully. "That's legitimate. But given the family's challenge to the will, I need to be careful. What specifically do you want to know?" "I'm trying to understand his financial situation, the business finances. Was there anything unusual in the last year?" Tom leaned back in his chair, considering. "Your father came in several times in his last months. He seemed troubled, asked about setting up trusts, about protecting assets. He wanted to make sure certain accounts couldn't be accessed by anyone but you." "What kind of accounts?" "I really can't say more without going through the proper legal channels. But I'll tell you this, your father was worried about something, or someone. He kept looking over his shoulder, if you know what I mean." Graham left the bank frustrated, but with one more piece of the puzzle. His father had been actively trying to protect assets in his final months. From whom? Miranda? The whole family? As he walked to his truck, he noticed a familiar Mercedes parked across the street. Miranda sat in the driver's seat, phone to her ear, watching him. Their eyes met for a moment before she started her engine and drove away. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she was following him. Back at the motel where he'd moved after the first night, the estate felt too empty, too haunted. Graham found his room had been searched. Nothing was taken, but his bag had been moved, his papers disturbed. Someone wanted him to know they could get to him whenever they wanted. He called Pemberton immediately. "They're trying to intimidate you," the lawyer said. "It's a common tactic in contested estates. They want you to feel unsafe, unwelcome. They want you to take a settlement and leave." "I'm not leaving." "Good. But Graham, be careful. I've seen estate battles turn ugly. People do desperate things when this much money is involved." That evening, Graham sat in his motel room with files spread across the bed, trying to make sense of the financial records he'd copied. His phone rang Danny's nightly call. "Hey, buddy, how was your day?" "Dad, when are you coming home?" Danny's voice held an edge of anxiety that made Graham's chest tighten. "Soon. Maybe a few more days. Is everything okay?" "Mrs. Chen is nice, but she doesn't make the eggs right, and she wants to watch the news all the time, and it's too loud. I know it's hard. I'm sorry, but this is important." "Is it about the money?" Graham hesitated. "It's about more than money. It's about understanding some things about my father, about our family." "Do I have to meet them?" "The family? No. You don't have to meet anyone you don't want to." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Chen says families are complicated. She's right about that." After he hung up, Graham stared at the financial records with fresh determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whatever his father had left him, it was Danny's future too. He couldn't let Miranda and her lawyers take it away. He pulled out his laptop and started searching for information about Ellroy Development Company. The company website was professional but vague, listing projects and services without much detail. But when Graham dug deeper, Searching newspaper archives at the local library's online database, he found more interesting material. 15 years ago, there had been a minor scandal. Allegations of bid rigging on a city contract for a new municipal complex. Several developers had been investigated, including Ellroy Development. The charges had been dropped, but the articles hinted at political connections and sealed settlements. Graham cross-referenced the dates with the financial records. Around that same time, there had been a major restructuring of the company. His father's brother, Miranda's father, Graham's uncle Thomas, had become a full partner. The company had grown rapidly after that, taking on bigger projects, making more money. And then, 10 years ago, Uncle Thomas had died. Heart attack, the obituary said. He'd been only 58. Graham leaned back, puzzle pieces shifting in his mind. His father and Uncle Thomas had been partners. There had been allegations of fraud. Then, Thomas died, and Graham's father had continued running the company alone for another decade. What if the allegations had been true? What if his father and uncle had been involved in something illegal? That would explain why his father had pushed Graham away to keep him out of it, to protect him from being implicated. But then why leave Graham everything now? Why not just donate it all to charity, wipe the slate clean? Unless his father was trying to make amends, unless leaving Graham the estate was a way of saying he was sorry, of trying to provide for his son in death the way he hadn't in life, or unless there was something in those files his father wanted Graham to find. Graham gathered up the papers and headed back to the estate. It was nearly midnight, but he couldn't sleep anyway. He let himself into the study and pulled out every file, every folder, every box. Somewhere in this room was the truth his father had been hiding. He worked through the night, coffee going cold beside him, sorting documents into piles based on dates and transactions. As dawn light crept through the windows, he found something that made him stop. A bank statement from an account he hadn't seen before. It showed regular transfers, large transfers going to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transfers had started 20 years ago and continued until just 8 months before his father's death. The amounts varied, but they totaled in the millions. Money flowing out of Ellroy Development to an account Graham couldn't trace. His father hadn't just been involved in something questionable. He'd been actively moving money offshore for 2 decades. Graham sat back, exhausted and sick. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was evidence. His father had left him a paper trail, documentation of crimes, proof of something Miranda clearly didn't want anyone to find. Now Graham understood why she was so desperate to contest the will. It wasn't about the money, it was about the files, about keeping whatever his father had documented hidden. The question was, what was Graham going to do about it? He looked at the compass sitting on the desk, its needle pointing steadily north. "When you're lost," his father had said, "this'll always point you home." Graham wasn't lost anymore. He knew exactly where he was and what he had to do. His father had left him a map, and Graham was going to follow it wherever it led, even if it meant destroying the family name, even if it meant facing truths he didn't want to know. For his father's sake, for Danny's future, for the truth. Graham contacted Harold Pemberton first thing Monday morning. The lawyer listened carefully as Graham explained what he'd found, the offshore transfers, the suspicious payments, the timeline that suggested systematic fraud spanning decades. "This is serious," Pemberton said when Graham finished. "If what you're suggesting is true, we're talking about major financial crimes. But Graham, you need to be very careful. Accusations like this without absolute proof could destroy your case and open you up to slander suits. I have the bank statements, I have the company records, which show money moving, yes, but they don't show criminal intent. They don't prove who authorized the transfers or why. For all we know, those offshore accounts were legitimate tax shelters or international business holdings." Graham leaned back in the motel room chair. "You don't believe that any more than I do. What I believe doesn't matter. What we can prove matters." Pemberton paused. "Let me do some quiet investigation. Don't confront anyone yet. Don't mention what you've found. Just sit tight for a few days. But sitting tight wasn't in Graham's nature, not anymore. He spent Monday morning at the Ridgemont Public Library, going through their historical archives. The library kept old newspapers on microfilm, and Graham scrolled through years of them, searching for any mention of his father's company. He found more than he expected. Articles about the municipal complex deal, about other development projects that had faced questions. One article from 18 years ago included a photograph of a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new shopping centre. His father stood in the centre of the group, looking uncomfortable. Beside him was Uncle Thomas, smiling broadly. Behind them, Graham recognized several faces: city council members, the mayor at the time, other business owners. And there was someone else he recognized, a younger Robert Sutter, identified in the caption as the CFO of Ellroy Development. Miranda's husband had been involved in the company for nearly 2 decades. Graham photographed the article with his phone, then continued searching. He found another interesting piece from 12 years ago, an obituary for Uncle Thomas. The article mentioned he was survived by his wife Diane, his daughter Miranda, and his son Paul. It described him as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, a devoted family man. It said nothing about the circumstances of his death beyond sudden heart attack. No details, no hospital, no funeral arrangements listed as public. Graham left the library and drove to the cemetery on the north side of town. It took him 20 minutes to find Uncle Thomas's grave. The headstone was modest considering his wealth. Thomas Richard Ellroy, 1955 to 2015, beloved husband and father. His father's grave was 3 rows over, the earth still fresh. Graham stood there for a long moment, looking down at the temporary marker. Richard James Ellroy, 1950 to 2025. "I wish you'd just told me," Graham said quietly to the grave. "Whatever you were trying to protect me from, I wish you'd trusted me enough to explain." The wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of cut grass and spring flowers. No answers came. That afternoon, Graham drove past Miranda's house, a modern construction in one of the newer developments. It was large, but not ostentatious, with a 3-car garage and a yard that looked professionally maintained. 2 expensive cars sat in the driveway, the Mercedes he'd seen Miranda driving and a BMW that probably belonged to Robert. He didn't stop, just noted the address and kept driving. But as he turned the corner, he saw Robert leaving the house, getting into the BMW. On impulse, Graham followed. Robert drove to a restaurant on the edge of town, an upscale Italian place that Graham could never have afforded to eat at. He parked and went inside. Graham waited in his truck across the parking lot, feeling ridiculous and investigative at the same time. 20 minutes later, Robert came out. He wasn't alone. The man with him was in his 60s, wearing a suit that screamed government employee. They stood by Robert's car, talking intently. Graham couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see Robert's body language: nervous, placating, defensive. The other man handed Robert an envelope. Robert opened it, glanced inside, then quickly closed it and shook his head. They talked for another minute before the man walked to his own car and drove away. Graham had his phone ready. He snapped several photos of the exchange, of the man's license plate, of Robert standing by his BMW looking worried. When Robert finally drove off, Graham didn't follow. Instead, he sat in his truck, thinking. Robert was meeting with someone, receiving something in an envelope, looking nervous about it. It could be innocent. It could be completely unrelated to the estate or the company. But Graham didn't think so. He drove back to the estate and spent the evening going through more files, this time focusing on anything with Robert Sutter's name on it. He found employment records showing Robert had started with Ellroy Development 20 years ago. Fresh out of business school, he'd risen quickly through the ranks, becoming CFO within 5 years. The same timeline as the offshore transfers. Graham was deep in a file of quarterly reports when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Graham Ellroy? A woman's voice, young, uncertain. Yes. Who is this? My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a state investigator with the Attorney General's office. I understand you've been asking questions about your father's business. Graham's pulse quickened. How did you know that? My grandmother is Lily Chen. She mentioned you'd been talking to her. And then I got a call from a bank manager named Tom Fitzgerald. He thought I should know about some concerns you raised. Are you investigating Ellroy development? I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I'd like to talk to you, in person. Can you meet me tomorrow? They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Olympia, halfway between Ridgemont and Seattle. Sarah Chen said she'd be wearing a blue jacket and would be sitting in the back. After he hung up, Graham sat in his father's study, surrounded by evidence of a life spent building something that was apparently rotten at its core. He thought about his father working late into the night, afraid and alone. He thought about the photograph on the bedside table, the young Graham holding a fish, both of them happy and unaware of what was coming. His phone rang again. This time it was Danny. Dad, are you okay? You sound tired. I'm fine, buddy. Just been a long day. Mrs. Chen says you should come home soon. She says I miss you. Graham smiled despite everything. Do you miss me? Yes. I don't like changes in routine. I know. I'll be home soon. I promise. Did you find out why your father left you the money? Graham looked around the study at the files, the evidence, the complicated legacy his father had left behind. I'm starting to understand. It's not what I thought it was. Is it bad? Out of the mouths of babes. It's complicated, but I'm going to make it right. Okay. I believe you. Those 3 words, I believe you, carried more weight than $4 million. Graham had to make this right, not just for the money or for justice, but because his son believed he could. And Graham Ellroy, 53-year-old mechanic who'd raised his boy alone and honest, wasn't about to let his son down. Graham woke up Tuesday morning to find an envelope had been slid under his motel room door. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in block letters on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Take the settlement and leave. $500,000. Cash, no questions. This is your only warning. No signature. No letterhead. Just the threat, wrapped in the illusion of an offer. Graham photographed the letter and envelope, then called Pemberton. The lawyer's voice was tight when he answered. Someone's getting desperate, Pemberton said. This is good for us, actually. It shows consciousness of guilt. They wouldn't be trying to buy you off if they had nothing to hide. Or they're just trying to make me go away because they think I'm a nuisance. A nuisance doesn't get offered $500,000. Keep that letter safe. It's evidence. Graham drove to Olympia for his meeting with Sarah Chen. The coffee shop was busy with the morning rush, but he spotted her immediately in the back corner. She was in her early 30s, professional in her blue jacket and slacks, with her grandmother's sharp eyes and serious demeanor. Mr. Ellroy. She shook his hand firmly. Thank you for meeting me. They ordered coffee. Graham got a plain black. She got something complicated with extra shots and sat down at a corner table where they could talk without being overheard. I want to be clear about something, Sarah said. I'm not officially investigating Ellroy development. Not yet. But I've had concerns about development practices in Ridgemont and surrounding areas for several years. There are patterns of bid rigging, suspicious approvals, projects that seem to benefit certain developers at the expense of taxpayers. And my father's company was part of that? I don't know yet. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Tom Fitzgerald mentioned you found some irregularities in the company records. Can you tell me what you found? Graham pulled out his phone and showed her the photographs he'd taken of the bank statements, the offshore transfers, the suspicious payments. Sarah studied them carefully, occasionally zooming in on details. These are significant, she said finally. May I send these to myself? Of course. She pulled out her own phone, and Graham shared the files. I need to verify the authenticity of these documents, of course. But if they're real, they show a pattern of systematic financial manipulation that's been going on for decades. My father was involved in it, Graham said. I've accepted that. But I think he was trying to make it right at the end. That's why he left everything to me. He wanted someone outside the family to find these records. Sarah leaned back, considering. That's a generous interpretation. Maybe, but I found something else. He showed her the threatening letter from that morning. Her expression darkened. Who else knows you're meeting with me? No one. I haven't told anyone. Good. Keep it that way. If someone's willing to threaten you over this inheritance, they might be willing to do more. She finished her coffee. I'm going to start a formal investigation. It'll take time, weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, be careful. Don't confront anyone. Don't let on that you're working with me. What about the will contest? I only have 30 days. The investigation will freeze everything. Estate proceedings will be put on hold until we determine whether any of the assets are proceeds of criminal activity. She stood to leave. Mr. Ellroy Graham, your father may have been complicit in fraud for years. If that's true, the estate could be seized, the inheritance dissolved. Are you prepared for that possibility? Graham thought about it. If that's the price of the truth, then yes. Sarah nodded approvingly. I'll be in touch. After she left, Graham sat in the coffee shop for a long time, nursing his cold coffee and thinking. If the estate was seized, Danny's future security went with it. But keeping money that came from fraud, from years of corruption, that wasn't the kind of legacy Graham wanted for his son either. He drove back to Ridgemont with a heavy heart. But as he reached the town limits, his phone rang. Pemberton. Graham. We need to talk. Can you come to my office immediately? What's wrong? Miranda has filed a motion to have you declared mentally unfit. She's using Danny's condition as evidence that you're too distracted to handle estate matters responsibly. The words hit Graham like a slap. She's using my son against me? Her lawyers are arguing that your focus on Danny's special needs demonstrates a lack of judgment. They've got a psychologist who's willing to testify that single parents of special needs children often suffer from decision-making impairments due to chronic stress. Graham's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That's ridiculous. It's desperate, which means she's worried. Can you come to my office? Graham turned the truck around, anger burning in his chest. They could question his motives, they could challenge the will. But bringing Danny into this, using his son's autism as a weapon that crossed a line. At Pemberton's office, the lawyer had copies of the motions spread across his desk. Graham read through them, each word making him angrier. They're saying I neglected to visit my father because I was overwhelmed by parenting responsibilities, Graham said. They're saying I manipulated him in his final months because I needed money for Danny's care. It's a legal strategy. A bad one, in my opinion, but Miranda's lawyers are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Pemberton pulled off his glasses. The good news is, no judge is going to declare you unfit based on this. You've raised Danny for 14 years. You have a stable job, a stable home. The motion will be dismissed. But the damage is done. She's made these claims publicly now. Yes. And that might be the point. She wants you angry, wants you to make mistakes. Graham forced himself to take a deep breath. I'm not giving her that satisfaction. But when he left Pemberton's office, he drove directly to Miranda's house. He knew it was a mistake, even as he was doing it, knew Pemberton would be furious, but he couldn't stop himself. He pounded on her front door. Miranda answered, unsurprised to see him, wearing exercise clothes and a superior smile. Graham, I wondered how long it would take you to show up. You leave my son out of this. Your son is relevant to the question of your competency. Danny has nothing to do with the will or the estate or your desperate attempts to steal what isn't yours. Miranda's smile widened. Steal? That's rich coming from you. You vanished for 30 years, then swooped in the moment there was money involved. I came because your lawyers called me. I didn't even know my father was alive, let alone that he had money. So you claim, but we have evidence otherwise. Phone records, Graham. Witnesses who saw you in Ridgemont 8 months ago. That's impossible. I haven't been here in 30 years. Then someone who looks remarkably like you was driving a truck with your license plate through town last summer. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. It was his truck, or one identical to it, parked on a Ridgemont street. Graham stared at the photo. I don't know what this is, but it wasn't me. Tell that to a judge. Miranda stepped back to close the door. Take the settlement, Graham. Walk away, because if you keep pushing, I'll destroy you. And I'll make sure everyone knows that your father left you everything because you manipulated a sick old man who didn't know better. My father wasn't sick, wasn't he? Her eyes glittered. How would you know? You hadn't seen him in decades. Maybe he was suffering from early dementia. Maybe he was on medications that impaired his judgment. My lawyers are very good at creating reasonable doubt. She closed the door in his face. Graham stood on her perfect porch in her perfect neighborhood, shaking with rage. Then he pulled out his phone and took a picture of her house, her cars, her address number. If she wanted to play dirty, he'd show her what a real fight looked like. But as he drove away, his hands steady on the wheel, he realized something. Miranda wasn't just fighting for money. She was terrified. Every move she made, the accusations, the threats, the attempts to discredit him, they all smelled like fear, which meant Graham was getting close to something she desperately wanted to keep hidden. That night, Graham couldn't sleep. He lay in the motel bed, turning the compass over and over in his hands, thinking about the photograph of his truck in Ridgemont, about his father's fear, about Miranda's desperation. Nothing made sense. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and turned on the light. The compass gleamed in his palm, solid and familiar. He'd carried it for 41 years, ever since his father had given it to him, through his mother's death and his father's rejection, through his marriage and divorce, through every hard day raising Danny alone. It had been his constant companion, a reminder that he'd once had a father who loved him. Graham studied the compass more carefully than he ever had before. The brass case was worn smooth, the glass crystal scratched but intact, the needle pointed north as it always had. But as he turned it in the light, he noticed something odd. The base of the compass seemed thicker than it should be, and there was a faint seam, almost invisible, around the bottom edge. His hand started shaking as he tried to twist the base. It resisted at first, then suddenly unscrewed. Inside the hollow base, something was taped to the metal, a small key. And beneath it, wrapped in plastic, a piece of paper. Graham's breath caught as he unfolded the paper, his father's handwriting unmistakable even after all these years. Box 447, First National Bank, for Graham only. I'm sorry. Graham sat on the bed, the key clutched in his fist, and started to cry. His father had planned this. 30 years ago, or maybe more recently, Richard Ellroy had hidden this key where only Graham would find it, had trusted that Graham would keep the compass, would eventually discover its secret. His father had left him a message, a way forward, an explanation. Graham called Pemberton at 2:30 in the morning. The lawyer answered on the 5th ring, voice thick with sleep. This better be important. I found a key, hidden in the compass my father gave me when I was 12. It's for a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Silence on the other end. Then, don't touch anything else. Don't open that box without me present. I'll meet you at the bank when it opens at 9. Graham spent the hours until dawn pacing the motel room, the key in his pocket, his mind racing with possibilities. What had his father hidden? evidence of the fraud, money, a confession. At 8:30, he drove to the bank. Pemberton was already waiting outside, carrying his briefcase and wearing an expression that was half excitement, half dread. "This could change everything," the lawyer said as they walked inside. "Or it could be nothing. We need to be prepared for either." Tom Fitzgerald was surprised to see them so early, but professional as always. When Graham showed him the key and explained about the safe deposit box, Tom's expression grew serious. "Box 447 has been here for 31 years, Tom said, checking his records. "Paid in perpetuity. Instructions specified it could only be opened by Graham Ellroy, or in the event of Richard Ellroy's death." "Can we open it now?" Graham asked. Tom led them to the vault, a climate-controlled room lined with safe deposit boxes. Box 447 was in the back, one of the larger ones. Tom used the bank's key along with Graham's key to open it. Inside was a thick folder, the kind lawyers use for important documents. Tom left them in a private viewing room. Graham and Pemberton sat across from each other at a small table, the folder between them. "You want to open it, or should I?" Pemberton asked. Graham's hands were shaking too badly. "You do it." Pemberton opened the folder carefully. Inside were dozens of documents, neatly organized with tabs and labels, bank statements, ledgers, contracts, and on top, a letter addressed to Graham in his father's handwriting. Pemberton handed Graham the letter. "You should read this first." Graham unfolded the pages with trembling hands and began to read. "Dear Graham, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've found what I left for you. I've practiced how to say this 1,000 times, and I still don't know how to make it right. I was part of something terrible. For years, your Uncle Thomas and I ran a fraud scheme through Ellroy Development. We rigged bids, paid off officials, inflated costs, and moved money offshore. We stole from the city, from taxpayers, from people who trusted us. I was young when it started, and I told myself it was just how business was done. By the time I realized how wrong it was, I was in too deep to get out. When your mother died, I looked at you standing beside me at her funeral, and I understood what I'd really lost. Not just her, but my integrity, my honesty, the man she'd married. I wanted to make it right, to go to the authorities, to confess everything. That's when Thomas threatened you. He said if I exposed the scheme, he'd make sure you were implicated. He'd plant evidence, create a paper trail, destroy your life before it really started. You were 23, Graham. You had your whole life ahead of you. I couldn't let him hurt you, so I pushed you away. I made you hate me. I made sure you stayed as far from Ridgemont and Ellroy Development as possible. It was the only way I could protect you. Thomas died 10 years ago. I won't say how that's between me and my conscience. But with him gone, I tried to make things right. I couldn't go to the police without destroying what was left of the family, without taking down people who'd had nothing to do with the worst of it. So I did what I could. I repaid what I'd taken, quietly, through anonymous donations and settlements. I documented everything, every crime, every payment, every person involved. Miranda found out what I was doing 6 months before I died. She'd been going through Thomas's old files and discovered the offshore accounts. She thought she could take over the scheme, continue it on her own. She and Robert have been stealing for the past 8 years, since Thomas's death gave them access to the accounts. When I changed my will to leave everything to you, I knew Miranda would fight it. That's why I'm leaving you this evidence. Everything you need to prove what happened is in this box. Bank, records, ledgers, recordings. I documented it all. I'm asking you to do what I was too afraid to do. Expose it, all of it. Turn it over to the authorities. Let the truth come out, even if it destroys the family name, even if people remember me as a criminal and a coward. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I threw away 30 years with you to protect you from a mess I'd created. I missed watching you grow up, missed meeting your son, missed being the father you deserved. I can never get those years back, and I can never make it right. But I can give you the truth, and I can give you the means to make sure no one else gets hurt by what I was part of. The estate is yours. Every penny of my share was earned legitimately in the last 10 years, after I stopped participating in the fraud. It's clean money. Graham, use it to build a good life for yourself and your boy. Use it to be the kind of father I wasn't. I loved you every day of your life, even when I couldn't show it. Especially when I couldn't show it. Everything I did was to protect you. I hope someday you can understand that. I'm sorry, son, for everything. Dad. Graham couldn't see the last lines through his tears. His father had loved him, had pushed him away to protect him, had spent 10 years trying to make things right while carrying the weight of his crimes alone. Pemberton waited quietly while Graham composed himself. Then the lawyer began going through the rest of the folder's contents. "My God," Pemberton said softly. "Graham, this is everything. Bank statements showing the offshore accounts, ledgers documenting every fraudulent transaction, contracts proving bid rigging. He even has recordings." Recordings? Pemberton held up several small cassette tapes, each labeled with dates. Audio recordings of conversations with your uncle, with Miranda, with city officials. This is prosecutorial evidence. This could bring down a dozen people. Graham looked at the mountain of evidence his father had compiled. 30 years of crimes, meticulously documented. A confession from beyond the grave. The key to understanding everything that had gone wrong, and the burden of deciding what to do with it. "There's something else," Pemberton said, pulling out a final document. "A partnership agreement from 1975, when your grandfather started the company. There's a clause here about criminal activity voiding all claims to the business. If any partner or family member is convicted of crimes related to company business, they forfeit all rights to company assets." Meaning? Meaning, if Miranda and Robert are convicted based on this evidence, they get nothing. The estate stays with you, free and clear. Graham picked up one of the cassette tapes. The label read, "Thomas Ellroy, the 15th of March 2015, final confrontation, 2 weeks before his uncle died." "I need to listen to this," Graham said. They found an old cassette player in Tom Fitzgerald's office. Graham inserted the tape with shaking hands and pressed play. His father's voice came through the speaker, tense and afraid. "I know what you've been doing, Thomas. I have all the records." His uncle's voice, angry and dismissive. "You're in this as deep as I am, Richard. You go down, I go down, we all go down. I don't care anymore. I'm tired of lying. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. You care about Graham, though, don't you?" A pause loaded with threat. "Shame if something happened to him. Accidents happen all the time. If you touch my son, you'll what? Go to the police? They'll want to know why you waited 20 years to grow a conscience. They'll want to know about all the money you took, all the contracts you rigged. You'll go to prison, Richard. And I'll make sure Graham's name is on enough documents that he goes down with you." Sounds of a scuffle, a crash, then silence. The tape continued for another minute, but there was nothing more, just the sound of heavy breathing and then a click as the recording stopped. Graham looked at Pemberton. "My uncle threatened me. My father was protecting me all those years." "And he documented the threat," Pemberton said quietly. "This tape proves your father was acting under duress. It doesn't excuse his earlier crimes, but it explains his silence." Graham carefully gathered all the evidence back into the folder. His father's confession, the financial records, the recordings, all of it. The truth, finally, after 30 years of silence. "What do you want to do?" Pemberton asked. Graham thought about his father, working late into the night, documenting his crimes, trying to make amends. He thought about Miranda and Robert, continuing the fraud, stealing millions, threatening him, and using Danny to get what they wanted. He thought about Danny, waiting for him in Seattle, believing his father was strong enough to do the right thing. "I want to call Sarah Chen," Graham said. "It's time to tell the truth." Sarah Chen arrived at the bank within 2 hours of Graham's call. She brought another investigator with her, a stern-faced man named James Porter, who specialized in financial crimes. They spent the entire afternoon in the bank's conference room, going through every document, every ledger, every tape. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said for the third time. "Your father documented everything, names, dates, amounts. He even has emails and phone records." "Will it hold up in court?" Graham asked. "Oh, yes, this is airtight. With this evidence, we can build cases against at least 15 people, city officials, contractors, developers, and Miranda and Robert Sutter are at the center of the recent activity." James Porter looked up from a ledger he was examining. "The offshore accounts show systematic transfers going back 8 years. That's after your uncle died. This is all Miranda and Robert's operation." "How much did they take?" Graham asked. "Based on these records, approximately $12 million over 8 years. They were actually more aggressive than your father and uncle were." Sarah leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in amazement. "Your father spent a decade making restitution. Look at these records: anonymous donations to the city's infrastructure fund, payments to contractors who'd been underbid, settlements with property owners. He was trying to pay back what he'd taken." Graham felt a lump in his throat. How much did he pay back? According to this, Sarah did some quick calculations, approximately $8 million. Most of his fortune went to making amends. That explained why the estate was only $4.3 million. His father had spent years quietly returning what he'd stolen, accepting a smaller fortune as the price of his conscience. "What happens now?" Pemberton asked. "Now, we build the case," Sarah said. "We'll need to verify these documents, trace the accounts, interview witnesses. It'll take several weeks, maybe months. But when we're done, we'll have everything we need for prosecution." "And the estate?" Graham asked. "Frozen until the investigation concludes." "But Graham, you should know, since your father was actively making restitution and cooperating by documenting the crimes, and since he was acting under threat to his son, we can argue for leniency in how his assets are treated. The estate will likely remain intact, with you as the legitimate heir. What about Miranda and Robert?" Sarah's expression hardened. "They're going to prison. The evidence against them is overwhelming. We'll probably start by freezing their assets tomorrow, before they have a chance to move money offshore or disappear." Graham thought about Miranda in her perfect house with her perfect life, thinking she'd gotten away with it, thinking she could intimidate him into giving up and going away. "There's something else you should see," he said, pulling out his phone. He showed them the photographs of Robert meeting with the man in the restaurant parking lot, the envelope changing hands. James Porter zoomed in on the man's face. "That's City Councilman Edward Brennan. He's been on the council for 15 years. If Robert's still paying him off, then the corruption is ongoing," Sarah finished. "This isn't just a historical case. They're actively committing fraud right now." She pulled out her phone and made a call, stepping away to talk quietly to someone. When she returned, her expression was grim. "We're moving up the timeline. We need to act now, before they realize we're investigating. Can you come to a mediation session tomorrow? The one Pemberton scheduled for the will contest?" "Yes, but why?" "Because we're going to serve warrants there, in front of their lawyers, in front of witnesses. I want everything documented. I want Miranda and Robert to understand they're not walking away from this." Graham looked at Pemberton. The lawyer nodded slowly. "It's unusual," Pemberton said, "but it might be the best way to prevent them from fleeing or destroying evidence. They'll be expecting a mediation session about the will. They won't be expecting a criminal investigation." That evening, Graham drove back to Seattle. He'd been away from Danny for almost 2 weeks, and he needed to see his son. He needed to hold him and be reminded why he was doing this. "Mrs. Chen answered the door of their apartment, relief evident on her face. "Oh, Graham, thank goodness. Danny's been asking for you every day." Danny was in his room, and he looked up when Graham knocked. For a moment, his face was blank, processing the change in routine. Then recognition and relief flooded his features. "Dad, you're home." Graham hugged his son, feeling Danny's thin arms wrap around him. Danny wasn't usually demonstrative, but he held on tight, his face pressed against Graham's shoulder. "I missed you, buddy. I missed you too." Mrs. Chen tried. "But she doesn't know how I like things." Graham smiled. "I know, but I'm home now." They ordered pizza and sat on the couch, Danny telling Graham everything that had happened while he was gone, the math test he'd aced, the argument he'd had with a classmate about the proper definition of a right triangle, the bird he'd seen outside the window that he'd identified as a cedar waxwing. Normal life, simple pleasures, the things that actually mattered. Later, after Danny was in bed, Graham sat alone in the dark living room, thinking about the next day. Miranda and Robert would be arrested. The investigation would become public. The Ellroy name would be dragged through the mud, his father's crimes exposed for everyone to see. But the truth would come out. And Graham could look Danny in the eye and say he'd done the right thing, even when it was hard. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Last chance. Take the money and walk away, or you'll regret it." Graham deleted the text and blocked the number. They still didn't understand. This stopped being about money the moment he read his father's letter. This was about integrity, about not letting corruption continue, about being the kind of man he wanted Danny to grow up to be. He pulled out the compass and held it in the dark, its brass surface warm from his hand. His father had given him this all those years ago, had hidden a key inside it, had trusted that Graham would eventually find it and do what was right. "I understand now, Dad," Graham whispered to the empty room. "I understand what you were trying to do." The next morning, Graham dropped Danny at school and drove back to Ridgemont. Pemberton had scheduled the mediation for 10 o'clock at his office. Sarah Chen and her team would be there, warrants in hand, ready to bring down the hammer. Graham arrived early. Sarah was already in the building, along with James Porter and 2 state troopers. They were coordinating the timing, making sure everything was ready. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked Graham. "Nervous." "Ready?" "I don't know. What you're doing takes courage. Your father would be proud." Graham wasn't sure about that. His father would probably rather the whole thing stayed buried, the family name protected, the crimes hidden. But his father had also left Graham the evidence, had trusted him to make the right choice. That had to mean something. At 9:45, Aunt Diane arrived with Paul. They both looked uncomfortable, out of place. Graham realized they probably had no idea what Miranda and Robert had been doing. They were just relatives who'd expected to inherit something from their uncle. At 9:55, Miranda arrived with Robert and 2 expensive-looking lawyers. She swept into the conference room like she owned it, radiating confidence and contempt. "Graham," she said coldly, "ready to accept reality and take the settlement?" "We'll see," Graham said quietly. They all took their seats around the conference table. Pemberton opened his portfolio, prepared to begin the mediation. The lawyers on both sides had their documents ready. It looked like a normal legal proceeding. Then Sarah Chen walked in, followed by James Porter and the state troopers. Miranda's face went pale. "What is this?" "Miranda Ellroy Sutter, Robert Sutter," Sarah said formally. "We have warrants for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and racketeering." The room erupted. Miranda's lawyers jumped to their feet. Robert tried to stand and leave, but a trooper moved to block the door. Aunt Diane gasped, her hand over her mouth. "This is outrageous," one of Miranda's lawyers sputtered. "On what basis?" Sarah placed a folder on the table. "On the basis of extensive financial records, witness testimony, and audio recordings documenting systematic fraud spanning 8 years. You'll have full access to the evidence during the discovery process." Miranda turned to Graham, her face twisted with fury. "You did this! You bastard!" "Your uncle did this," Sarah corrected. He documented everything. Graham just had the courage to bring it forward. Robert had gone grey. "Miranda, tell them this is a mistake. Tell them we didn't." "Shut up, Robert." Miranda's composure was cracking. "Don't say another word. Not another word." The troopers moved forward with handcuffs. Miranda held out her wrists, her eyes never leaving Graham's face. The hatred there was pure and absolute. "Your father was a coward and a thief," she hissed, "and you're just like him." "No," Graham said quietly. "I'm not. That's the difference." They led Miranda and Robert away. Their lawyers followed. Already on their phones, no doubt calling more expensive lawyers, starting the machinery that would try to fight the charges. Paul was crying. Aunt Diane looked shell-shocked. "I didn't know," she said to no one in particular. "I swear I didn't know." "We believe you," Sarah said gently. "You and Paul aren't under investigation. This is specifically about Miranda and Robert's activities." Pemberton cleared his throat. "In light of these developments, I move that the will contest be dismissed and Graham Ellroy be recognized as the legitimate heir to the Ellroy estate." No one objected. Paul just shook his head numbly. Aunt Diane had her face in her hands. Graham stood up, legs shaky. It was done. The truth was out. Justice was coming. But he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt tired and sad and ready to go home. Sarah walked him out to his truck. "Thank you for coming forward with this. It took real courage. I just did what my father asked me to do. He asked you to do the right thing, knowing it would be hard. That's the definition of courage, Graham." Graham drove out of Ridgemont for what he hoped would be the last time in a long while. In his rearview mirror, the town disappeared, along with the Ellroy estate, the lies, the corruption, all of it. He was going home to Danny, to their small apartment and their simple life, to the things that actually mattered. The compass sat in his cup holder, pointing north, always north, toward integrity, toward truth, toward home. The mediation had been scheduled in Pemberton's largest conference room, the one with windows overlooking Ridgemont's main street. Graham sat across from Miranda and Robert, flanked by their team of attorneys. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany table, highlighting the tension in every face. Pemberton had barely opened his mouth to begin when Sarah Chen entered, and the whole room shifted. Miranda's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Cross, stood immediately. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private mediation." "Not anymore." Sarah placed her credentials on the table. "I'm Special Investigator Sarah Chen with the Washington State Attorney General's office. We have warrants to serve." Graham watched Miranda's face carefully. For a woman who'd spent her life in control, the moment of losing it was stark. Her porcelain composure cracked like ice, confusion and then fear flickering across her features before she could lock them down. Robert was less composed. He half stood, looking at the door where a state trooper now stood blocking the exit. "This is a mistake. We haven't done anything." "Mr. Sutter, I suggest you listen before speaking." Sarah pulled out a thick document. "We have evidence of systematic financial fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering spanning 8 years. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, falsified contracts, payments to city officials." "Should I continue?" "This is absurd," Miranda said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Graham has clearly fabricated evidence to support his fraudulent claim to the estate." Pemberton slid a document across the table. "This is the partnership agreement from 1975, when the company was founded. There's a clause here you should read, Section 7, Paragraph 3. Victoria Cross picked it up, her expression growing more concerned as she read. "This can't be enforced." "It absolutely can," Pemberton said. "It clearly states that any partner or family member convicted of criminal activity related to company business forfeits all claims to company assets. It was written by your uncle specifically to protect the company from corrupt partners." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Miranda leaned forward, her mask finally slipping completely. You think you're so righteous, don't you, Graham? Coming in here with your worn-out clothes and your sad story. But you're just like the rest of us. You want the money. You want what you think you're owed. Graham met her eyes steadily. I want the truth. There's a difference. The truth? Miranda laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You want the truth? Your father was a criminal. He and my father stole from this town for 20 years. They ruined people, destroyed competition, lined their pockets while pretending to be pillars of the community. That's your precious father's legacy. I know, Graham said quietly. I've read his confession. I know what he did. Then you know the money isn't clean. You know it's built on fraud and lies. So take it and spare me the moral superiority. My father spent 10 years making restitution, Graham said. $8 million in anonymous payments, settlements, donations. He tried to make it right. How noble! Miranda's voice dripped with sarcasm. He got to die with a clean conscience, while the rest of us were left to deal with the mess he created. Sarah Chen cleared her throat. Miss Ellroy Sutter, the difference is that your uncle stopped. He documented his crimes. He cooperated with authorities through the evidence he left behind. You and Mr. Sutter continued the fraud. You expanded it. You stole $12 million over 8 years, with no intention of making restitution. Robert finally found his voice. Those accounts, they were already established. We were just managing existing assets. Robert, shut up. Miranda's command was sharp, but it was too late. James Porter, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. So you admit you knew about the offshore accounts? That you accessed them and managed the funds? Robert's face went grey. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but the damage was done. Miranda stood abruptly. We're not saying anything else without proper legal counsel. Victoria, tell them we're not answering any more questions. That's your right, Sarah said calmly. But we're still serving the warrants. She nodded to the troopers. As they moved forward, Paul spoke for the first time since the meeting began. His voice was quiet but clear. Mum, did you know about this? About what they were doing? Aunt Diane looked at her son, then at Miranda. My daughter wouldn't, she's not capable of. Your daughter has been stealing from the city for 8 years, Sarah said, not unkindly. We have documentation of every transaction. Aunt Diane's face crumpled. Paul put his arm around her shoulders, shooting Miranda a look of betrayal and confusion. I was protecting the family, Miranda said, her voice rising. Everything I did was to protect what we'd built. You were protecting yourself, Graham said, and you would have destroyed anyone who got in your way, including me. You're right, Miranda said coldly. I would have. I still might. The state trooper stepped forward with handcuffs. Miss Ellroy Sutter, please stand and place your hands behind your back. The moment the handcuffs clicked around Miranda's wrists, the conference room descended into chaos. Victoria Cross was shouting about illegal procedures and improper notice. Robert's lawyer was on his phone, calling what Graham assumed was a criminal defense attorney. Aunt Diane was openly sobbing now, Paul trying to comfort her while looking lost himself. Through it all, Miranda stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Graham with an intensity that made his skin crawl. You have no idea what you've done, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise. The people we paid off, the officials who took our money, they're not going to go down quietly. You've just painted a target on your back. Is that a threat? Sarah asked sharply. It's a warning. Miranda's smile was cold. Graham might think he's the hero in this story, but he's just opened a door he can't close. My lawyers will tear apart every document, every recording. We'll show that Richard Ellroy coerced me, manipulated me, that I had no idea what was happening with those accounts. The evidence says otherwise, James Porter interjected. We have emails with your name on them, transfers you personally authorized, meetings you attended with city officials. Miranda's smile didn't waver. Emails can be faked. Transfers can be explained. Meetings are just meetings. You'll have to prove intent, Mr. Porter. And intent is very difficult to prove. Robert finally broke. Miranda, stop. Just stop. His voice cracked. They have recordings, they have everything. Your uncle documented it all before he died. My uncle was demented in his final months, Miranda said smoothly. Everyone knows that. He wasn't in his right mind when he changed the will, and he certainly wasn't in his right mind when he was supposedly documenting these alleged crimes. Sarah Chen pulled out one of the cassette tapes. This recording is from 8 months ago, Miss Ellroy Sutter, your uncle confronting you about accessing the offshore accounts. Would you like me to play it? For the first time, real fear flickered across Miranda's face. You can't use that. It was recorded without my consent. Washington is a two-party consent state, but there are exceptions for documenting criminal activity. Sarah's smile was professional but cold. Your uncle knew exactly what he was doing. The state trooper touched Miranda's elbow gently. Ma'am, we need to take you in for processing now. Miranda jerked away from his touch. Don't you dare. Then, seeming to remember her situation, she straightened. I'll walk out on my own. As the troopers led her and Robert toward the door, Aunt Diane reached out. Miranda, sweetheart, tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them you didn't know. Miranda looked at her mother with something almost like pity. Of course I knew, Mother. I'm not an idiot. Father started this, and Uncle Richard wanted to blow it all up out of some misguided guilt. I was just protecting what was rightfully ours. But you said, Aunt Diane's voice broke, you said the will was fraudulent. You said Graham manipulated Richard. I said what I needed to say to keep the money in the family where it belongs. Miranda paused at the door, looking back at Graham one last time. You think you've won, Graham. You think you're the good son who did the right thing. But you've just destroyed your own family. Every newspaper in the state will run this story. The Ellroy name will be synonymous with corruption and fraud. Your son will grow up knowing his grandfather was a criminal. Graham stood, finally finding his voice. My son will grow up knowing his grandfather made mistakes but tried to make them right. That's more than you can say. How touching. Miranda's voice dripped with contempt. Enjoy your inheritance, Graham. Every penny of it came from the crimes you're so eager to expose. You're no better than the rest of us. The difference, Pemberton said quietly, is that Graham is trying to make it right, just like his father did. His father was a coward who waited 30 years to grow a spine, and by then it was too late. Sarah Chen nodded to the troopers. That's enough. Let's go. They led Miranda and Robert out of the conference room. Through the windows, Graham could see a small crowd gathering on the street below, phones out, recording the moment when Miranda Ellroy Sutter and her husband were loaded into a police car. By evening, it would be all over the local news. By tomorrow, probably statewide. Aunt Diane stood shakily, Paul supporting her. She looked at Graham with red-rimmed eyes. I didn't know, she said again, as if saying it enough times would make it true. I thought Richard was just being stubborn about the will. I never imagined. I know, Graham said gently. But my daughter. She couldn't finish the sentence. Paul guided his mother toward the door, then paused to look back at Graham. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Miranda has been out of control for years. Someone needed to stop her. He hesitated. I'm sorry about your father. I'm sorry about all of it. Graham nodded, unable to find words. Paul and Aunt Diane left, leaving Graham alone with Pemberton and the investigators. Well, Pemberton said after a long moment, that went about as expected. Graham sank into his chair, exhausted. Is it really over? The arrests are over. The investigation will continue for months. There'll be a trial, probably multiple trials. But yes, the immediate crisis is over. Pemberton placed a hand on Graham's shoulder. You did good, son. Your father would be proud. Graham wasn't sure about that. His father would probably have preferred the secrets stay buried, the family name protected, the crimes hidden forever. But his father had also left him the evidence, had trusted him to make the hard choice. Sarah Chen was packing up her files. "Graham, we'll need you to testify eventually. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes." "Good. Because Miranda's lawyers are going to come at you hard. They'll try to discredit you, claim you manipulated your father, argue that you manufactured evidence. It's not going to be pleasant." "I understand." She nodded approvingly. "The estate will remain frozen until the trial concludes. But once it does, assuming everything holds up, and I believe it will, you'll be the sole heir. All of it will be yours, free and clear." Graham thought about that. $4 million, a house, a legacy, all built on crimes and restitution, corruption and attempted redemption. "I'm selling the house," he said suddenly. "I don't want it. I'll sell everything and put the money in trust for Danny. For his future." Pemberton smiled. "I think that's wise." Graham stood, ready to leave Ridgemont for what he hoped would be the last time. He had to get home to Danny, had to hold his son and remind himself what actually mattered. As he walked out of the building into the bright afternoon sun, he pulled out the compass. It pointed north, as always, toward home, toward the life he'd built with his own hands, separate from the Ellroy legacy of fraud and secrets. His father had given him this compass 41 years ago and told him it would always point him home. He'd been right, just not in the way either of them had expected. Graham got in his truck and drove away from Ridgemont, toward Seattle, toward Danny, toward the future. In his rear-view mirror, the town grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared. He never looked back. 3 months later, early spring arrived in Seattle with cherry blossoms and the smell of rain. Graham stood in front of the Ellroy estate one last time, Danny beside him, both of them looking up at the massive Victorian house that would soon belong to someone else. "This was Grandpa's house?" Danny asked. "It was. It's really big." "Too big for us, buddy. We don't need a house this size." The real estate agent had assured Graham that the property would sell quickly, waterfront estate, historic home, prime location. The asking price was high enough that it would add significantly to Danny's trust fund. Between the house sale and the liquid assets from the estate, Danny's future was secure. College, therapy, whatever he needed, Graham had made sure of it. But first, Graham had wanted Danny to see it, to understand where his grandfather had lived, what he'd built, what he'd tried to protect. They walked up to the front door. Graham still had the keys, though in a few weeks he'd turn them over to the new owners. Inside, the house echoed with their footsteps. Most of the furniture had been sold, donated, or put in storage. Only the essentials remained. "Can I see Grandpa's room?" Danny asked. They climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. Graham had kept the photograph from the nightstand, the one of him as a child with his father, both of them smiling. It sat on Danny's dresser now, a reminder that people were more complicated than they seemed. That love could exist even in silence. That trying to make things right mattered, even if you failed. Danny walked around the empty room, running his fingers along the windowsill. "Mrs. Chen says that your father loved you very much." "He did. I know that now. But he didn't talk to you for a long time." "No. He was trying to protect me from something bad. Sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense to anyone else." Danny considered this with the seriousness he brought to all complicated questions. Did he make the right choice? Graham looked out the window at the manicured grounds, the established trees, the careful landscaping. "I don't know. Maybe. He did what he thought was best at the time." "Are you glad he left you the house?" "I'm glad he left me the truth. The house is just a house." They walked through the rest of the rooms, his father's study, now empty of files and evidence, the kitchen where his mother had made Sunday dinners all those years ago, the library where he'd done homework as a child. Each room held memories, good and bad, all tangled together in ways Graham was still trying to understand. In the study, Graham showed Danny the compass. "Your grandfather gave me this when I was 12. He said it would always point me home." Danny examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "Does it?" "It does. Just took me a long time to understand what home really meant." They locked up the house and drove into town for lunch. At a small cafe, they ordered sandwiches and sat by the window. Danny worked on a puzzle book while they waited for food, and Graham watched his son with the contentment that came from knowing he'd done right by him. His phone buzzed. A text from Pemberton. "Trial date set for September. You'll need to testify. Are you ready?" Graham texted back. "Ready." The trials would be difficult. Miranda and Robert were fighting the charges with expensive lawyers and aggressive strategies. They'd already filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming his father's recordings were inadmissible, but Sarah Chen was confident. The paper trail was too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. 2 city officials had already taken plea deals, agreeing to testify against Miranda and Robert in exchange for reduced sentences. The dominoes were falling, just as his father had documented they would. Graham's phone buzzed again. This time, an email from the community foundation he'd established. With $1 million from the estate, he'd created a fund specifically for families with special needs, children, therapy, equipment, respite care, whatever they needed. The foundation had already helped 15 families in the Seattle area. Danny had helped name it the Richard Ellroy Second Chances Foundation. His father would have appreciated the irony. After lunch, they drove back to their apartment. It was still small, still in a building with peeling paint and a slow landlord. But Graham had decided not to move. This was home. This was where he'd raised Danny, where they'd built their life together. No amount of money would change that. That evening, after Danny was in bed, Graham sat in the living room with a beer and the compass. He thought about his father, working late into the night, documenting his crimes, trying to make things right. He thought about the 30 years of silence, all of it meant to protect Graham from a legacy of corruption. His father had made terrible choices, had committed crimes, had hurt people, had destroyed his relationship with his only son. But he'd also tried to make amends, had spent his final years paying back what he'd stolen, protecting Graham one last time by giving him the truth. It didn't make everything okay. It didn't erase the 30 years or bring back the relationship they'd lost. But it meant something. It meant his father had loved him, even from a distance, even in silence. Graham's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. It was late, and he didn't recognize the number. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Ellroy, this is Janet Morrison. I worked with your father on the restitution payments." Graham sat up straighter. "I didn't know anyone else was involved. Your father wanted it that way. He asked me to wait until after his death to contact you. I have some letters he wrote. He wanted you to have them, but not until everything came out. Not until you understood." "Letters? About why he did what he did, about his regrets, about you and Danny. He wrote them over the last year of his life. There are 23 of them." Graham's hands tightened on the phone. "Can you send them to me? I'll mail them tomorrow." "Ellroy Graham, your father was a complicated man, but he loved you more than anything. I hope the letters help you understand that." After he hung up, Graham sat in the dark living room for a long time. 23 letters. His father's voice, finally explaining, finally telling the truth he'd kept hidden for so long. Graham looked at the compass on the coffee table. Its needle pointed north, steady and true. Home wasn't a place or a house or a fortune. Home was Danny sleeping safely in the next room. Home was doing right by the people you loved, even when it cost you everything. Home was the truth. Finally told, finally understood. Graham picked up the compass and held it close. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. "I understand now. I finally understand." The compass pointed north. Always north, toward integrity, toward redemption. Toward the future he and Danny would build together, free from secrets, built on truth. Outside, rain began to fall on Seattle, washing the streets clean. Graham set the compass on the shelf beside the photograph of his father and his younger self, both smiling, both unaware of what was coming. But they'd made it through. Both of them, in their own ways, had found their way home. The needle pointed true. It always had.